Okay, so this is the Bible study for 2 Samuel 7, and then we're cross-referencing also 1 Chronicles 17. But I probably won't read that as we're entering into the study because in most cases, and for the majority of the text, it's basically almost the identical text. There's not a lot of differences. So we're going to be answering most of the questions straight out of 2 Samuel 7. So I'm just going to read that. So the text says, after the king was settled in his palace and the Lord had given him rest from all his enemies around him, he said to Nathan the prophet, here I am living in a house of cedar while the ark of God remains in a tent. Nathan replied to the king, whatever you have in mind to do, go ahead and do it, for the Lord is with you. But that night, the word of the Lord came to Nathan, saying, go and tell my servant David, this is what the Lord says. Are you the one to build me a house to dwell in? I have not dwelt in a house from the day I brought the Israelites up out of Egypt to this day. I have been moving from place to place with a tent as my dwelling. Wherever I have moved with all the Israelites, did I ever say to any of their rulers whom I commanded to shepherd my people Israel, why have you not built me a house of cedar? Now then, tell my servant David, this is what the Lord Almighty says. I took you from the pasture, from tending the flock, and appointed you ruler over my people Israel. I have been with you wherever you have gone, and I have cut off all your enemies from before you. Now I will make your name great, like the names of the greatest men on earth, and I will provide a place for my people Israel, and I will plant them and so that they can have a home of their own and no longer be disturbed. Wicked people will not oppress them anymore, as they did at the beginning, and have done ever since the time I appointed my leaders over my people Israel. I will also give you rest from your enemies. The Lord declares to you that the Lord himself will establish a house for you. When your days are over and you rest with your ancestors, I will raise up your offspring to succeed you from your own flesh and blood, and I will establish his kingdom. He is the one who will build a house for my name, and I will establish the throne of his kingdom forever. I will be his father, and he will be my son. When he does wrong, I will punish him with a rod wielded by men, with floggings inflicted by human hands. But my love will never be taken from him, as I took it away from Saul, whom I removed from before you. Your house and your kingdom will endure forever before me. Your throne will be established forever. Nathan reported to David all the words of this entire revelation. Then King David went in and sat before the Lord, and he said, who am I, sovereign Lord, and what is my family that you have brought me this far? And as if this were not enough in your sight, sovereign Lord, you have also spoken about the future of the house of your servant. And this decree, sovereign Lord, is for a mere human. What more can David say to you? For you know your servant, sovereign Lord. For the sake of your word and according to your will, you have done this great thing and made it known to your servant. How great you are, sovereign Lord. There is no one like you, and there is none but you, no God but you, as we have heard with our own ears. And who is like your people Israel, the one nation on earth that God went out to redeem as a people for himself, and to make a name for himself, and to perform great and awesome wonders by driving out nations and their gods from before your people, whom you redeemed from Egypt. You have established your people Israel as your very own forever, and you, Lord, have become their God. And now, Lord, keep forever the promise you have made concerning your servant and his house. Do as you promised, so that your name will be great forever. Then people will say, the Lord Almighty is God over Israel, and the house of your servant David will be established in your sight. Lord Almighty, God of Israel, You have revealed this to your servant, saying, I will build a house for you. So your servant has found courage to pray this prayer to you. Sovereign Lord, you are God. Your covenant is trustworthy, and you have promised these good things to your servant. Now be pleased to bless the house of your servant, that it may continue forever in your sight. For you, sovereign Lord, have spoken, and with your blessing, the house of your servant will be blessed forever. Okay, so remember that you can download PDF copies of this Bible study at www.abqnaz.org/alive so that you can follow along with us in this study. Number 1 says, what happened in our last Bible study in 2 Samuel should be 2 Samuel 6. It says 2 Samuel 5, but that was 2 studies ago, I believe. A, David decided to bring the ark of the Lord to be with him in the city of David. That's true. B, the ark was put on a cart, and one of the men guiding the cart reached out to steady the ark when the oxen stumbled and was struck dead. That's true. C, David decided not to bring the ark to Jerusalem because of these types of curses. And that's true. D, David heard that Obed-Edom's house was blessed since the ark had been with him, and that's true. E, David decided to bring the ark to Jerusalem, but involved the Levites this time and had the ark carried as it was supposed to be, and that's true. F, Michal was not impressed with David's dancing, and that may be an oversimplification of what happened in that section of the text, but that's a good thing to remember, that Michal did not like what David was doing, and we can remember David's response. Number 2, what did David say to Nathan the prophet in 2 Samuel 7:1? So now we're in this text, and in 7:1 it says, actually it's in 7:2 where he actually says it. He said to Nathan the prophet, here I am living in a house of cedar, while the ark of God remains in a tent. And then how did Nathan respond in verse 2, which is actually verse 3? I'm sorry about that. How did Nathan respond in verse 3? Nathan replied to the king, whatever you have in mind, go ahead and do it, for the Lord is with you. For those of you reteaching this text, you'll be really confused if you didn't watch this video because of the misprints or typos. And so if you come to me asking, then I'll know you didn't watch this video because I correct it. We'll just say that's on purpose then. 2 Samuel 7:2 is when David says this to the prophet. And then in verse 3, Nathan responds and says, whatever you have in mind, go ahead and do it, for the Lord is with you. Now, it's an interesting thought here because so let me just tell you how I messed this up before I go on. That if you read in 1 Chronicles 17, which is where I was looking when I was writing the questions, and it's almost identical, then David says it in verse 1, and then Nathan responds in verse 2, and then question 3 that says 3 through 17, that's the verse delineations in chapter 17 of 1 Chronicles. So because these words are exactly the same, or at least really for the most part very similar, but the verse divisions are different. I ended up looking at the wrong text as I was writing that, so that's why the verses are off. Anyway, I'm sorry about that anyway. And so then back to what we're actually talking about. David says, this is what I want to do. He tells the prophet, and the prophet sort of, it seems like instinctive reaction or natural reaction is do what you have in mind to do. Do what's in your heart to do. Do what you think is right. But so it says what happens in verse 3 through 17. That's 3 through 17 of the First Chronicles text. It would be 4 through 17 in the Second Samuel text. We find out that God speaks. So what happens in verses 3 through 17 or 4 through 17, depending on the text that you're looking at? That night, the word of God came to Nathan. That's true. B, God gave Nathan a message for David. That's true. C, God seems to kind of like dwelling in a tent and tells David that he has never asked for a house of cedar. And that's true. He says, have I ever, in all the years that I've dwelt in this tent, asked any of the leaders to build me a house of cedar? So a big part of that was God didn't want to dwell in a house separate from his people. He wanted to dwell near his people. And particularly when they were moving around, that meant a tent that moved around with them. But I do think there's something to building a house for God that makes him feel like he's distant because he's in that house and we're in this house, as opposed to a tent that is encamped with us, where our tents are all right next to each other. I would say, if you've ever camped in tents of any type, the tent next door to you is very close, even closer than the house next door to you, physically, and also what you can hear that's going on over there in terms of privacy and things like that. And so I think there's something to God wanting to dwell with his people and not be placed in a separate house. And maybe that sounds like semantics, but I think in practice, the tent might have felt closer. Although I know also that the tent was sometimes pitched outside of the camp of Israel. So perhaps that undoes that thought. But D, God describes the blessing he has brought to David and how he will bless Israel, and that's true. E, God tells David that his son will succeed him and he will be the one to build the house for the Lord, and that's true. So I want to just set for a minute in the contrast between question 2 and question 3, and how Nathan's initial response to David compares to what happens when God specifically speaks. So our tendency, and I think temptation, would be to say, oh, see, Nathan the prophet was wrong. Nathan the prophet told David to do what seemed right to him, but God had a different plan. Nathan maybe should have never told him that. But I would argue in some ways that's true, and God had a different plan than what it seemed right in David's heart and what they would have done absent from God speaking. But I'm not sure, like, God's tone in this text does not seem angry that David, to me at least, does not seem angry that David had this in his heart to do. And I would say that if our hearts are right with God, then oftentimes our inclinations, although they may be colored by our fleshly desires and what seems normal to us from a societal perspective and all of that, certainly they're influenced by those. But I think when our heart is right with God, then oftentimes our inclinations are with the right heart attitude or with the right motives. So when I look at David's intention here, I don't see selfish motives. If anything, I see that he looked at his situation and saw that his situation seemed to be quite selfish, since he was in a house of cedar and God was living in a tent, basically, is the way he describes it. That he wanted to do this thing that was not selfish. He wanted to make things right with God by building this. So there was So his inclination seemed right both to him and to the prophet. And so I think that natural inclination was actually selfless. And if our hearts are right with God, I think it is good practice to go with our inclinations, unless God tells us otherwise. So I'm trying to describe a life, a Christian life, in such a way that I think a lot of times we sort of uber spiritualize our lives and say, well, I won't do anything unless God tells me. Well, let's just be honest. In my day, I do get up early and go to prayer. But I can't say that every day when I get up and go to prayer, I ask God, God, should I go to work today? And wait for his response. Even if my work has been at the church, I don't say, God, should I go into the church this morning? And sometimes I say, God, I don't want to go into the church this morning. I'll be honest. God, I need your help to even step foot in the church with these people today. There are days like that, okay? But in general, I don't wake up and ask God, okay, should I go into work today? Should I go to the church today? Should I do this today? But rather, I pray about things that seem to be pressing, that I want to go well. If I have a meeting with somebody who's upset, or somebody who maybe is not really doing things right in terms of, at least in my opinion, in serving God, those are things that I pray about. If I have somebody that I know is struggling, or somebody who is close to my heart, and they're struggling with health, or spiritual things, or whatever, I'm praying for them. Those things that seem to me to be pressing. But a lot of the normal everyday things, I don't like go to prayer and ask for specific direction on. Instead, what I do is I do what seems right in my heart to do, which, if I'm in right relationship with God, I believe is selfless and is his will. So if what seems right in my heart to do is very selfish and not of God at all, well, then I should be careful about that. That doesn't seem like it's right with God. And so I should do the thing that seems like it would be the will of God to me, until and unless God says to me something specific that may be different from what I thought. So I would say that I read this, and my first instinct and inclination is not, oh, David messed up, Nathan messed up, they should have went and asked God what to do like they did before these certain battles, and they should have listened to God, and they messed up, and now God's got to correct them and give them this vision. And that really doesn't seem to be the tone of this text, but rather this text seems to be that David wanted to do a good thing that was selfless. When Nathan heard it, his heart sort of resonated with that. That sounded like a good thing that was selfless. And his natural thought was, yeah, if that's what God seems to be impressing on you to do, then do it. But then God spoke to tell them, I know this thing is a good thing that you want to do, but it's not the God thing. It's not the thing that I want you to do. So I'm going to give you more specific direction within what seems like it might be the will of God. And I'm going to tell you, you're right to think this, but really I've never asked for this. And instead, it's not you that's going to do it, but he says it's going to be your son. And in saying that, he really does give David a blessing, even if it's not the blessing of him being able to build a house for God. So I want to say all that because I want us to be realistic that sometimes there's those moments when if our life and our guidance from God, if we're living with a selfless heart because he's changed our heart, then sometimes the right thing is to do what seems right to us, to be the thing that God would want, until he tells us otherwise. And so I think it is totally legitimate for us to move forward doing the thing that seems best to us when we have a heart that is sort of synchronized with God, until he tells us something different. And we don't always need to pray before we do everything of the day, but we just do the thing that we think God would have us do until he tells us a more specific thing. And if we're listening to God, if we're in a place where we're listening to God, I think that's an okay thing to do and place to be. Now, if our norm is very selfish and we're not really listening to God at all and paying attention to his will, and what seems right in our hearts to do is the selfish thing, then don't do that. That I'm not talking to you about that. I'm not talking to the average person who does things in a selfish way and doesn't listen to the call of God or isn't sensitive to the call of God. I'm talking to the person who who the norm of your life has become selfless because God has impacted your life and changed you from a selfish person to a selfless person, at least on the whole. And you're constantly listening for the voice of God. For you, I would say it's a good thing to do what seems right to you until the time where God tells you more specific instructions, something different to do. I'm bothered often by Christians who are sitting on their butt in their chair saying, well, I'm waiting for God to tell me to do something. God's given you a lot of general revelation already in scripture. God's told you a way to live your life already. So you've already got instructions. Follow those instructions until you get more specific instructions from him. And that's what I would say. I think it's lazy and disingenuous for Christians to not do anything until God gives specific instructions. Do something, do what it seems like God would want until you get specific instructions. Be listening, be sensitive during that time, but do what seems right, seems like the thing God would want until he tells you something more specific. In this case, the thing that they were going to do was not bad, but then God said, give this message to David. This is what I really want. And I think God will not hesitate to speak to us if we're listening, to give us more specific instructions in those times where what seems right to us is not exactly what he wants. And number 4 says, how should David feel about this? Or perhaps how would you have felt? Corrected for not really listening to God. So I've already been kind of talking about this. And I'm not sure that this is how David should feel, but I do think sometimes this might be the way we feel in this kind of circumstance. But from my experience with God's correction, this does not seem to be a harsh correction to me. Be blessed because God has described how he has and will bless David. Excuse me, I'm getting the hiccups. I'm going to pause for a moment and try to take care of those. Okay, thank you. I think that pause has helped. So blessed. I do think that he should feel blessed because God is saying, I've blessed you and this is how I'm going to continue to bless you. C says checked. He meant well, but he almost moved forward without the Lord. But God gave him a more clear plan for how this plan would be accomplished. So I would say checked is probably a better description of this than corrected. Corrected is when you're headed the wrong way and you have to be redirected into the right way. Checked is where you were about to do something that didn't seem bad, but maybe was not exactly what God wanted you to do. And he checked you before you went forward and redirected you in the right direction. And so I think checked is a better description of this. And checked is where God is guiding us. Checked is where God speaks to us before we step forward in a direction that may not be the way he wants us to go. And instead he checks us and say, hold on, it's not bad what you were about to do, but it's not my best. And this is what I want. So I think that's a better description of that. I've heard pastors say, I felt checked in my spirit. I was about to do this, which didn't seem like a bad thing to do, seemed like the right thing to do, but I felt checked in my spirit that God may actually rather want me to do this. And I've heard that phrase used before, or that terminology used before, and I think it's a better terminology for what this is. There are definitely times in scripture where correction is used and where David is corrected, but in this case I think it was more of a check before he went forward in a direction that was not the perfect will of God. He was checked and instead told what God really wanted. D, overjoyed. He just got a promise that Saul never got about his son and how God would work through him. So Saul never got this promise that his son would become the leader of Israel. David just did. Now, I don't know at this point if he understands which son, but he knows that one of his sons is going to be the leader of Israel after him, and God is going to continue to work through him, and God is establishing his kingdom. I don't know if there's a greater promise. I think in my youth, and some may think that I'm still pretty young, I don't feel like it anymore. I feel like I've crossed a boundary, and I'm a little more aged and hopefully wise, although I'm not sure, than I used to be. And in my youth, a lot of my thoughts were to the things that I would accomplish and I would do. I'm crossing that boundary to where my kids are not far from adulthood, although many days it seems like they're far, but they're really not far from adulthood now in their teenage years. And I'm thinking a lot more about what they will accomplish than I'm thinking about what I will accomplish. If you're looking at averages in human development and in our societal norms, we enter the workforce. I graduated college and entered the workforce at 22. So I've been in the workforce now for 20 years. It used to be that you entered retirement and Social Security age at 62. And I know they keep pushing those years back a little bit. But if 62 was still that age, then I'd be halfway through my working years, according to our cultural understanding of that. Maybe I'm a little less than halfway now, but nonetheless, what I'm saying is, in my early years, I was thinking, what will I accomplish? You may think, well, maybe halfway through is in your prime because you're not so young and foolish anymore, but you're not yet on your downhill yet. And so maybe I'm right in my prime of accomplishing things. I don't know. It doesn't feel like it. And I'm thinking a lot about what will be accomplished after me, what will be accomplished by my children. And maybe some of that has to do with the life changes that I've gone through over this last year, and how it's given me different perspectives. But I would be overjoyed at this age and in my thinking now to think that I was not going to accomplish a certain thing, but my kids would. That's how that would make me feel. When I was 20 or 25, I may not have been as overjoyed at that thought. So anyway, David should feel, I think, overjoyed about this blessing that God has given him. Number 5, according to David's prayer in 16 through 26, how did he feel? And again, that 16 through 26 is in the verses in Chronicles rather than in the verses in 2 Samuel. It would be in 18 through 29 in 2 Samuel that I'd be looking at. Humbled. He remembers what God has done and how undeserving he has been. So he starts out that text, this prayer, with, who am I and what is my family that you've brought me this far? That's a humbled statement. Be honored. He may not build the house for the Lord, but his son will. So that's definitely in here, along with the humbled statement. So in verse 20 of making sure it's 2 Samuel this time, it says, what more can David say to you? For you know your servant, sovereign Lord. For the sake of your word and according to your will, you have done this great thing and made it known to your servant. So he's counting this thing that is promised to be done. Not just what God has already done, but this promise that he's given about his son. He's counting it as already done. You've done this great thing. See, thankful. He praises God for what he has done. How great you are, sovereign Lord. There is none like you. So that's he's praising God. He's thankful for what God has done in verse 22 of 2 Samuel. Content. He prays for God's will to be done and is grateful for God's promises. He says, your covenant is trustworthy in verse 28. Now, please bless the house of your servant, that it may continue forever in your sight. So basically, now that he knows the will of God, I don't think it's presumptuous to be praying that God do what he said he was going to do. He is happy. He is sort of resonating or in agreement with what God has said he's going to do. So therefore he is content with God's promise, not upset that he won't be able to do it, but grateful now that he knows. So he was discontent. You could say he had a lack of contentment when he realized he was in this house of cedar. And he wasn't, it's not that he wasn't content with what his circumstances were. He just didn't feel like it was right what the circumstances were with the presence of God and his place, his dwelling place. And so there was a discontent there that made him feel like he needed to do something. And then God says, no, I don't want you to do something, but rather this is my plan, and my plan is for your son to do this. And so now there's a sense of contentment where it's not, I'm not supposed to do this, so I'm going to rest in this thought that you have promised to do this, and I'm trusting you. So God, do what you said you're going to do. And that's a sense of contentment. That can be, in a situation where you don't like the situation, and maybe David might have felt that if he wanted to build this, yet it's contentment to be okay with the will of God instead of what my will was. So that's where we're looking at that. And we see all of the above in his prayer. Number 6 says, how do you feel when God reveals his will to you, even when it is not exactly what you thought or expected? Most of us, our Bible study answer would be, yeah, all of this, humble, content, all of this, thankful. But I would say for most of us, we struggle with that when God's will isn't what we were hoping for or expecting. And so we need to adjust from how we might be tempted to feel, perhaps in some ways, to the place where we are humbled, honored, thankful, content. I apologize. It's so funny when I wrote this, that the words are so much the same, but the verse levels are different, or lines divisions are different between the Second Samuel text and the First Chronicles text, that I used the wrong verses and still thought I was in the Second Samuel. So I apologize for that. I don't think it'll cause too much confusion, I hope. But I did say you really only need to read one of these, so hopefully you can work that out and explain it to the folks if you're reteaching this. Hopefully it's made sense what I've said if you're just watching this to learn it straight from here. And anyway, it's good to be with you, and we'll talk again soon.